Hi friends, this is Walker Armstrong, Executive Director of the Pilot Mountain Baptist Association, with part 5 of Leading in a Crisis and looking at the leadership loop. Again, as a point of reference, this is our illustration called the leadership loop. And over the last 4 weeks, we've been looking at what we call the path of influence of how to become a person of character. And last week we covered the last in that series, which is lifting your capacities. Lifting your capacities. And in that, we saw how if a leader is not continually growing and developing, they begin to diminish the resources they have to lead from. We talked about that from a standpoint of asking the diagnostic question, am I operating from a mindset of scarcity or am I operating from a mindset of abundance? Now, when you're operating from a mindset of scarcity, you believe that you don't have enough, you don't know enough, you're not capable enough to lead in your current context. And we not only feel overwhelmed in this situation when we have a mindset of scarcity, here's something that really happens with most of us when we operate that way, is that we'll try to cover up our leadership anorexia or our leadership deficiencies by either resting on our laurels or past accomplishments or overemphasizing our authority. And in that situation, we begin to diminish our leadership impact. We become cynical and superficial, and thus, over time, diminish our leadership capital. But when we operate from a mindset of abundance, we realize that every experience we've had, every gift or ability we've been given, can be pulled into that particular context to lead. And that's very significant because we believe that God has given us what we need in the present moment to do what we need to do as leaders. So that abundance mindset gives us a sense of calling and gives us a sense of effectiveness because of all that God's done in our lives. The primary value that supports lifting our capacity, we said, was stewardship. And I define stewardship as the mindset of seeing ourselves as responsible people before God to maximize all that we have been given for God's glory, our abundance, and others' benefit. So stewardship is really thinking about what I'm responsible for and how to respond in that way. Now this week, looking back at the model, what we're talking about is the first step in the impact, the path of impact, and that is possibilities to investigate. Now again, if you'd like a copy of this model, you can email me at walker@pmba.org and I'll be happy to send you a copy. So what are we talking about? We talk about possibilities to investigate. In its very essence, what we're saying in this step, in the path of impact, is we're looking at ways in which the organization or group we lead can improve, can change. Now the diagnostic question we ask in this case is this: have we become stagnant as an organization or group, or are we on the path of perpetual improvement? Are we stagnant, or are we on the path of perpetual improvement? Now, it's easy to become stagnant as an organization, especially if you've experienced any past success. It's easy, as I said earlier, to rest on your laurels, to think that past success equates to future success, when in reality, we know from experience it doesn't. And so we begin to when we rest on our laurels, we begin to get lazy, get inattentive to what's around us, and we gradually lose organizational effectiveness and excellence. The foundational skill here that we need to look at, and when it comes to perpetual improvement, is the passion to keep growing. And what feeds that passion to keep growing and keep improving is vision or visioning. Now, I've developed a definition from several sources, Andy Stanley, Will Mancini, the authors Coos and researchers Coos and Posner, and others like Kassenbaum, and I come up with this simple definition of vision. Vision is an inspiring picture of the future where we can see what could or should happen. Vision is an inspiring picture of the future where we see what could or should happen. An organization cannot survive long without renewing vision. In fact, I would say just like leaning into your story or self-awareness is the initial primary skill or ability we need to be people of influence. In like fashion, I would say that possibilities to investigate is the first step, or vision is the first step to becoming an effective leader and a person of competence. The challenge with this, in many ways, is this, that we think that leadership, and even more particularly here, vision, is only reserved to a select number of people. And that we assume that if you're a leader, you're automatically going to have vision. In other words, we look at vision as some kind of magical attribute or byproduct of being a leader. And I would tell you this afternoon that even apart from supernatural enablement by God for a particular time and place and context, vision, it involves hard work. And because every Christian is in the priesthood of believers, if you have responsibility in leading anybody, whether it's a family, an organization, or a group, or a small group, or a Sunday school class, or any kind of situation, you can have vision. What I want us to do today is look at 4 steps to developing that vision. And particularly, I want to look at the life of Moses as examined in Exodus chapters 3 and 4. Now, I'll have to say that writers and thinkers and leaders like Henry Blackaby and others have greatly influenced me in thinking about this, and I'm in debt to Henry Blackaby and all that he's taught me over the last several years of my life about how God calls us into a love relationship with Him that's real and personal. And I'll be using some of those insights, but digging a little bit more particularly and in detail with this whole issue of vision. So let's look at that. The first step I want us to see in developing a compelling vision is the step of illumination. Illumination, what does that mean? It simply means to become aware of something. In the life of Moses, in chapter 3 of Exodus, we find him tending the sheep of his father-in-law, Jethro. Now, to give us a backstory to this, 40 years earlier, Moses was nurtured and developed in the premier country during that time of history. He received the best education. He received the most benefits. He had been exposed to the most powerful military leaders of his day. And somewhere along the line, he became aware that he was not an Egyptian, but actually Jewish. And one day when he saw an Egyptian taskmaster brutalizing one of his fellow Israelites, he killed that man and buried his body. And sometime later, when he was trying to settle a dispute between the Israelites, they questioned him and asked if he was going to do the same thing to them that he did to the Egyptian. It was then that Moses realized he had to flee for his life, and he did, and went to the backside of the desert, married a native from that land, and really totally reinvented his life. Had children, worked for his father-in-law, and some 40 years later in Exodus chapter 3, we find him going about his daily duties of shepherding. Now that's what I really want you to notice in this story as it relates to vision, is that you don't have to manufacture vision out of thin air. If you are a person who embraces the discipline of daily responsibility and the discipline of daily engagement of life, in due time you will notice something that piques your interest or stirs your heart. The seed for vision begins with illumination. It begins with this idea that you become aware of something. You might become aware of an injustice that you weren't quite aware of before. You might become aware of an opportunity or possibility to look into. You might become aware of a need to meet. But whatever the particular application, what's important about vision is something comes across your mind that makes you stop and pause. That's what Moses did. He saw a bush that was aflame but was not consumed. And it made him pivot, turn, and go approach that thing which piqued his interest. So here's the key for us as we think about becoming people of vision. The key is being fully engaged in your life as it is right now, and becoming a keen observer of your life and everything around you in the present tense. Oftentimes, the reason we don't have a vision is we're not fully engaged in our lives. Over the years, I've really appreciated the Gallup organization's study of employee engagement in organizations. And a few years back, they estimated that only approximately 27% of Americans were fully engaged at work. Think about that for a moment. 27% of Americans were fully engaged at work. That is, that they were fully invested, fully aware, fully cognizant, fully focused on what they were doing. That tells you that we lose a lot of productivity. In fact, Gallup estimated that American companies each year lose billions of dollars because of a lack of full engagement of their employees. The same applies to you as an individual. You've got to be fully engaged in your life. You might think your job is boring or your life is routine, but I promise you that if you're following God, if you're a disciple of Jesus Christ, your life is not routine or boring. There's something connecting you to the eternal God. And a vision will surface when you begin to notice things that you think are out of the ordinary in your daily routine. For vision to have real purpose, it's got to involve not just your idea, but something else. And that leads us to the second step, which is invitation. First, there's illumination, becoming aware. Second is invitation. That is that what you're interested in and even what you're passionate about has got to take on another degree of seriousness and gravitas and weight when it gets integrated with what God is up to on planet Earth. In other words, when your burden gets connected to God's agenda and you're invited by God to be involved in His kingdom work, that's when it takes on a greater persuasive power. It's one thing to say, hey, I've got an idea about something I'd like to do. But it's another thing to say, something that burdened me led me to understand something on a deeper level of which I think God wants us to be involved in. That's when vision takes on an even deeper, more profound level. And in the stage of invitation, I think it's very important for us to understand that for us to be involved in kingdom work, it's not inviting us, it's not inviting God into our story, but it's God inviting us into His story. And that's where we know that the real power to persuade and the power to operate in this vision comes from is from God's invitation. What happened with Moses? God said to Moses, the ground you're standing on is holy ground. He spoke to him out of the bush. What does that mean? Well, among other things, it's not that there was a temple or a tabernacle nearby. What God was saying was, I'm getting ready to reveal to you what I'm about to do. And what was God about to do? He had heard the cries of His people for over 400 years, and it had reached to the critical mass point where He was ready to act. And He wanted to use Moses in that process to liberate His people from Egyptian slavery. That's the bigger picture. Moses was interested in a phenomenon that led him to a grander scheme of things that God was up to and revealing to him about. So there's illumination and there's invitation. The third step is investigation. Investigation is the overall assessment of how you think God has prepared you and provided for you in this assignment. Now, as you recall, when we talked about the path of influence, this was all about internal development for you as a leader, of how God has been working in your life through your story, through establishing values, through giving you gifts, for you responding as a steward. He uses all of those things to bring about your input into groups and organizations. And investigation is coming to grips with how God has prepared you. Now, interesting thing about this story that I always find strangely encouraging for me is Moses began to argue with God about this assignment. And I think he argued with him about two kinds of areas. One is the area of authority, and two is the area of ability. So the first question I think Moses basically asked God was, well, when I go, God, who will I say that has sent me? In other words, this is a big deal. I'm going to a group of people that have known nothing but slavery for 400 years. And on top of that, I'm telling the most powerful man on the earth to let his free labor go. By what authority can I do that? And God reveals His name. a special name to Moses, which is Yahweh, which basically means I am that I am, or I am who I am. And what God was saying, I am the self-existent one who stands above time and space and all human authority. And when you're with me, you will be part of something that will be accomplished. It's very important for us to understand that it's the God of Yahweh. It's God, the Lord Jesus Christ. It's the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit who call us into this enterprise and gifts us the way we need to be gifted. Now, I'm telling you that oftentimes as a leader, we need to track back into where a real sense of authority comes from. It doesn't come from us. It comes from the God who has saved us and the God who has gifted us and now the God who has called us into this current context. So that's a question of authority. The question of ability is something really interesting to me about this. Again, Moses pushes back to God and basically it's not so much, I think, he defies God, as he really begins to wonder, does he have what it takes? Not only does he not have the authority he thinks he should have, he doesn't have the ability. And God has him do two things that I think are fascinating. The first that you probably all remember is that he has him throw down a shepherd's staff. And what does it become? It becomes a serpent. And then he has him pick it back up and it becomes a staff again. What does this mean? I think it can mean a number of things. But in this context, what I think about is that God is showing Moses that there is no such thing as an ordinary ability, an ordinary assignment, an ordinary talent, an ordinary gift when it comes to his calling. You know, oftentimes I hear people say, well, God can't use me because I am just a fill in the blank. Or how can God use my nursing or my accounting or my skills as a plumber or my skills as a gardener or my skills as a housewife? We often basically diminish what God has gifted us in because we don't think it's significant enough to be used in his service. And I would say to you that anything God gifts you to do, he can enable and empower to do his work. Oftentimes I find people want to argue with God because they feel insecure about what they have or don't have. This again goes back to last week's lesson on the mindset of scarcity versus the mindset of abundance when we talk about lifting and developing our capacities. But I think probably with Moses there was something deeper going on. You remember the story that 40 years earlier he felt compelled to deliver one Israelite from the hands of an Egyptian taskmaster, and it failed miserably. So I'm sure Moses wondered, how can the last 40 years of me working on the backside of the desert, of me rejecting all my education, all my hopes and dreams, all my experiences, and just serving in anonymity, how can that make any difference now? The second thing God had him do was he had him place his hand in his cloak, and when he pulled it out, it was leprous. And when he put it back in, it was made whole. What does this mean? I think that what this could refer to here in our context is that there's no kind of brokenness, no kind of shame, no kind of debilitation that can keep you from serving God if you are walking in right relationship with him. Now there's the key. If you're walking in right relationship with him. Oftentimes, I know from my own life and the lives of those that I've ministered to over the years, that they talk about past failures, limitations. Maybe their health is not great. Maybe they have some sort of handicap that they think totally disqualifies them from service. A weakness or a failure, what Paul might call in 2 Corinthians 12, a thorn in the flesh. And I'm telling you that back then, even before the law was written, leprosy was like a game changer. If you had leprosy, that was it. You had to be rejected. You had to live separately from people. You were basically part of the living dead. And so I think God was showing Moses that if you could imagine the worst possible scenario for you as a leader, if you became totally leprous, I could still use you to help deliver my people. Friend, I don't know where you are today. I can tell you long stories about things God has done in my life, of how He's restored me and healed me. He's changed me from the inside out many, many times. And you come to a place in your life when you see God work in your life that you recognize that if you're living in right relationship with Him, He can heal you, He can forgive you, and He can restore you so that you can be an effective servant of His. That is what investigation is about. I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed when you sense God calling you to something. It's easy to feel overmatched in that situation. But the God who called you is the God who has been equipping you. Because He's Yahweh, because He stands above time and space and all authority, He knows your past from your present to your future. And He has been involved in your life, even in unseen ways, in orchestrating things so that you can be doing what you're doing. That's the third step. Fourth, final step is what I would call initiation. This is about taking the first steps you need to take to make the vision a reality. Even after God showed Moses all these things, even after He told Moses what He was getting ready to do and how He was going to act in miraculous ways through many miracles to deliver His people, and that even those people would receive wealth from the Egyptians just to get them out of their hair. Even after all those things that were going to happen, let me tell you something. Moses still argued with God. In that point, he was arguing with God about, listen, I'm not a good speaker. How many of you said that before? I am not a good public speaker. As if that was the ultimate litmus test of whether or not you could be a leader. And finally, God said to Moses, don't you have a brother named Aaron? I'll use him too. Now, this wasn't a demotion in my mindset. This was an illustration of what we all need, which is we need vision partners. Every one of us needs a vision partner. We need a supporter, an early adapter, someone who feels and thinks the same way we do to build momentum as we begin to share the vision that God has laid on our hearts. You can't go from 0 to 60 when you talk about displaying and sharing vision with people. You've got to have enough organic momentum under you with some initial people, a handful of people, a critical mass of people that believe wholeheartedly in what you're talking about, that it's just as much a part of them as it is a part of you. And that is crucial. We need people to be on board with us before we make some big public presentation of vision. Here's where I find a lot of leaders fumble the ball on the goal line. And that is they're premature in pronouncing a vision before having a foundation of supporters behind it. You know, you need other people with other perspectives, other gifts, other burdens that still see the same things you do and want to be on board with you in seeing something profound and powerful happen through you. So it's very important to see that those initial steps in establishing a vision is getting a group of people around you that want to be partners with you in that. So there's illumination, there's invitation, there's investigation, and there's initiation. So as we wrap up today, let me ask you a couple questions in our context of the COVID-19 pandemic and how we're seeking to lead in the middle of a crisis. First question is this: has the COVID-19 phenomenon shaped or impacted any vision you have? If it isn't, and it hasn't, you're not paying attention. It should. It should impact it to some degree or another. It should shape how you're going about what you feel like God's called you to do. How could it shape you to see what might happen, what could happen out of this? Listen, even in the midst of crisis, we are presented incredible, unique opportunities that we didn't know about before. Maybe there's another type of question you should ask: what should happen? What has been broken that this crisis is now revealing about the church, about your own life, about your workplace? What is God teaching you in the midst of this? Many of us have more downtime on our hands than we've had in a while. And it's tempting to kind of binge watch on Netflix or catch up on our favorite book. But beyond that, we ought to be doing deep inventory and asking ourselves, what is God teaching me about being a parent, about being a friend, about my workspace, about my life in church, about my relationship with God? What am I learning from that? It might be important in conjunction with that to ask ourselves a question: how is God preparing me for something new and something different? And finally, who could be a vision partner or partners with me in this process? So take this time to adapt, improvise, and refine your vision for your family, for your own life, for your ministry, for your workplace, so that God can use that when you begin to reemerge from this crisis to do something that would glorify His name, would fill your life with abundance, and would help others in the long haul. God bless you. I look forward to meeting with you next week.